We will begin Shabbos Daf Ayin Aleph at the bottom of Daf Ayin. We'll review a case which we discussed on the Daf there. The Gemara, along throughout the Daf Ayin Aleph, will have several cases of situations in which you did two of the same Aveira. Let's say you ate Chaylev twice. And the question here will be, when do you have to bring two separate Karbanos for each separate Aveira, even though it's the same type of Aveira? And when can you cover both of them with one carbon? We'll have 3 or 4 different cases which are complex, and each one will be discussed at length. So first of all, let's review the basic halachas which we need to know. Let's go to Chilul Shabbos. When somebody violates Shabbos, he does 2 malachos. But the only reason he did the 2 malachos was because he forgot today was Shabbos. So that's only one mistake. He only has to bring 1 carbon chatas for both of them. If, however, he knew it was Shabbos and he forgot that each of those 2 malachos were, so that's 2 mistakes. He has to bring a separate carbon chatas. Now, what if somebody does 2 of the same aveira? He lights a fire on Shabbos morning and lights a fire Shabbos afternoon. So here the halacha is as follows. If he found out in between the 2 averos that it was asur, he realized his first thing was asur, that divides into 2 separate incidents, 2 separate forgettings, 2 separate lapses of knowledge, and therefore he has to bring 2 separate karbanos chatas. If, however, he didn't realize until after he did them both, meaning both of them happened in one period of forgetfulness, 1 karban chatas covers both of them. Now the Gemara's first case is where a person did 4 averos in one Shabbos. He did 2 sets of 2. Let's say Shabbos morning, he cut off a fig. It has to be the minimum size for Chilul Shabbos, which is a dried fig, a gregaris. He cut off a fig, that's 1 malacha kitzira, and then he ground it up, that's another malacha tchina. He did that Shabbos morning. Now, the Shabbos morning was done because he forgot that it was Shabbos, and therefore he only has to bring 1 carbon chatas for both of them. However, Shabbos afternoon, he had already realized it was Shabbos, but then he forgot that cutting and grinding is also to do on Shabbos, so he cut and ground again. Now he has to bring 2 chatos for this incident because there were 2 mistakes. He forgot the cutting zasser, forgot the grinding zasser. Now, the situation the Gemara discusses here is where the person found out that he did an avera and he set aside a carbon. And the question is, though, how many of these 4 averos that he did, the 2 sets of 2, are covered by this carbon that he set aside? So we have 2 scenarios. The first one everybody agrees to, and that's where he found out that the first set of averos that he did Shabbos morning, where he had forgotten that it was Shabbos and he was only chayav 1 carbon, he realized about that and he set aside a carbon for that. So the Gemara says that it's pashut that covers all 4 averos. But it covers those 2, the grinding and the cutting that he did then, because those were under 1 mistake that he didn't realize that it was Shabbos. And it covers the other 2 as well, because the cutting covers the cutting that happened later, because they're both the same aveira and he didn't find out about it in between. And the grinding covers the grinding because they're both the same aveira. Now, the question is, what happens if it's the other way around? He first found out about the later scenario that was asur. He found out, let's say, that the cutting that he did, or he found out that both of them were asur, and he set aside a carbon for that. So let's say he set aside a carbon for cutting. So that's definitely not going to cover the grinding that happened then, because he needs 2 separate karbanos for that, because the mistake there was 2 things. He knew it was Shabbos, he forgot that cutting zasser, forgot that grinding zasser. Now everybody agrees, though, that the carbon is set aside for cutting also covers the cutting that happened earlier in the day, because it's the same aveira. And everybody also agrees that it'll also cover the grinding that happened earlier, because that cutting and grinding are both 1 mistake that he didn't realize it was Shabbos, so therefore they're both included in 1. The question is, can you actually take it a step further and say that the grinding that happened earlier, since it's covered by the cutting, which is covered by the later cutting, that grinding even covers the later grinding because they're both the same aveira? Rava says, no, you can't go that far. Abaye says, yes, why not? The later cutting, he brought a carbon for. That covers the earlier cutting as it's the same aveira. That covers the same time grinding, the earlier grinding, which happened at the same time, because there the only mistake was that he didn't realize it was Shabbos, so it's 1 mistake. And then that grinding covers the later grinding because it's the same aveira. That's what Abaye holds. So now the Gemara says, are you sure that Rava even goes so far? Are you sure that Rava even says that any of the grindings are covered over here? I'm going to prove to you that Rava doesn't hold that way at all. Rava doesn't hold that you can combine things like that. And now we're going to discuss a case of eating chaylev, where somebody ate 3 pieces of chaylev. And the way this worked was that the first 2 pieces he ate without finding out anything was forbidden, and the last 2 pieces he ate without finding out that anything was forbidden. However, the first and the third don't combine, because by the time he ate the third one, he had found out that the first piece of chaylev that he ate was asur. So between the first and the third, you can't combine them, because there he knew that, by the time he ate the third, he knew that the first one was asur. So the first can combine with the second can combine with the third, but the first and third can't combine. So over here, the halacha is as follows. Everybody agrees that if he brings a carbon and he sets aside specifically for the second eating, that works for both. Because the second can combine with the first. He didn't find out anything between them. And the second can combine with the third. Didn't find out anything about either of those two between them. Question is, what happens if he brings either for the first or for the third? So Abaye says, no problem. The first can combine, let's say he brings for the first. That can combine with the second. And then the second can combine with the third. And therefore everything's covered. Rava says you can't. It doesn't work like that. You cannot go from A to B and then from B to C. So the Gemara is asking, there's a Machlokes Rishonim which case the Gemara is asking on here, but the Gemara is asking, we'll go with Taisvus' pshat, that since you can't go from A to B and from B to C, so from A to B to C, so then in our case, how could you go from cutting to cutting? It's two separate incidents and you found things out in between. So Gemara says that really Rava held this way at first, but then once he heard Abaye, he accepted it from Abaye. He said you could go. So Gemara says, but he didn't go so far as to say that you could go from cutting to grinding to grinding. That would be 3 jumps. That would be 1 included and then 2 steps further removed. That he doesn't hold of. He did hold of the case that Abaye said that he ended changing his mind in the case of the 3 pieces of chaylev, and he said you can go from A to B and from B to C, but to go for 3 steps, to go from cutting to grinding, that he didn't hold of. Now, the Gemara says Abaye and Rava both seem convinced here that, at least as far as the bottom line, that the 2 cases, the same Aveira covers each other. The cutting covers the cutting, and the grinding covers the grinding, even though they're 2 separate cases really. In the first one, the only mistake was they didn't realize it was Shabbos. In the second set, he realized it was Shabbos and he didn't realize that cutting is Asr and grinding is Asr. Now the Gemara says that that's Pashat to Abaye and to Rava, it's not Pashat to Rabbi Zera. The Gemara says there was a question, it's not here, it's not clear who asked who, if it was asked to Rabbi Zera, if it was asked to Rabbi Asi. But the question was, very similar case, except that instead of the cutting and the grinding being a full shear, it was each half a shear. He cut half a shear, and he ground half a shear, and then later he cut half size and he ground half size. So the question was asked, can you combine the half cutting with the half cutting later to make a full cutting and make one obligation of chatas? And can you combine the half grinding earlier with the half grinding later and make one full shear out of that? And the Gemara says the answer was given that you can't combine them. Since it will be 2 separate, if it would have been 2 separate full shiurim, which is like our case, which Abaye and Rava were discussing, if that would have been the case, you would have to bring separate chatais. You cannot cover cutting and cutting with one chatas and say it's one aveira because the cases are different. The mistake was different. In one case, he didn't realize it was Shabbos. In the other case, he knew it was Shabbos and he didn't realize that cutting is us. So since you can't combine them into one carbon chatas, so if you have 2 halves, you can't combine them at all, and therefore you don't have any chiyuv chatas. So you see clearly that this Rabbi Zera or Rav Asi, whoever it was, is not like Abaye and Rava, that you can combine these 2 separate sets, one where the mistake was Shabbos and one where the mistake was the Isser Melach. The Gemara now asks, hold on a second, this Rabbi Zera is also making an assumption which is not so simple. And the Gemara is going to show from a Mishnah and a comment of an Amora that an assumption that he's making is not true. He's making the assumption that the same halacha would apply to combining 2 full shiurim into 1 carbon. The same halacha would apply to combining 2 half shiurim to get to a chiyuv carbon. Right? He had said that since if it would be 2 full shiurim, you couldn't combine it into 1. If it's 2 half shiurim, it doesn't combine and you don't therefore have any chiyuv. But that's not necessarily true. I'm going to prove this from a Mishnah. The Mishnah says as follows. First of all, it says if somebody eats 2 pieces of chaylev and he didn't realize in between that it was aser, he only has to bring 1 carbon. If, however, he eats, let's say he eats chaylev and he eats some blood and he eats some pigel and some noiser, so then they are separate things. He has to bring a separate carbon for each of them, even though he didn't realize anything in between because it's different medium. In this way, different averas is more chomer than 1 avera. It is if it's different species of averas, it's more chomer, it's stricter than if it's 1 avera. However, there's a way in which it's more lenient. What's that? Let's say you only ate half shiurim. You ate half a kezayis of chaylev, and within a kedei achilas pras, you ate another half kezayis. So since it's the same min, so it combines, and now you have a chil of chaylev. have chiyuv chatas. If, however, it would be different minim. Let's say, for example, the Mishnah doesn't say this, but let's say, for example, he ate a kazayas chaylev and he ate a kazayas of blood. A few seconds later, they don't combine. It's 2 half shiurim. You don't have any chiv. You just have a bunch of half shiurim. So now the Gemara says, let's think about this for a minute. The Mishnah tells me that if I ate a kazayas chaylev and then a few seconds later I ate if I ate half a kazayas chaylev and then a few seconds later I ate another half, then I'm chayiv. Of course you are. It's within a shir kedei achilas pas. It's one eating, for sure you're chayiv for that. So Rish Lakish had answered that this is the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua. And what happened is that these 2 chaylevs that you ate were prepared differently. One was roasted and one was cooked. And Rabbi Yeshua says that if it would be full kizaysim, you couldn't combine them into one chiv because they were prepared differently. Therefore, you would have to bring 2 separate kabbanis. You couldn't combine them. And you may think that he would say the same thing about half kizaysim, and therefore, if you ate half kizayis of chaylev cooked and half kizayis of chaylev roasted, you couldn't combine it into one chiv. You're not a chayiv anything. And the Mishnah comes to tell me you are a chayiv. So you see clearly that the halachos of combining 2 whole kizaysim and combining 2 half kizaysim are different. So how could Rabbi Zera assume that they're the same? So Gemara says, you got Rish Lakish wrong. That's not the case Rish Lakish was talking about. Rish Lakish was talking about the last phrase of the Mishnah. The last phrase of the Mishnah said that if you eat 2 separate minim, 2 separate types of Aveira, and they're each a half kazayas, you do not combine them and you're pater. And Rish Lakish had asked, of course not. If I ate half a kazayas of chaylev and half a kazayas of blood, how could I combine them? And Rish Lakish had answered, it's not talking about half kazayas of chaylev and half kazayas of blood. It was talking about 2 kazayas and 2 half kazayas of chaylev. But one of them was cooked and one was roasted. And it's telling you, and this is the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua. Just like Rabbi Yeshua says, in the case of 2 full kazayas that you can't combine them into one carbon, the 2 half kazayim, you can't combine into one carbon either if they're cooked separately. One is roasted and one is cooked. So you see that the halachos are really the same. Combining full kazayim and combining half kazayim are the same halacha. Rabbi Yeshua holds in both those cases you cannot combine them if they're prepared differently, and everybody else holds it's no different. There was not a problem on Rav Zera that he held that the 2 were the same. Gemara says, hold on a second, not so fast. It's a nice answer, but then the Mishnah doesn't make sense, because if 2 types means that they were cooked different ways, but they're both chaylev, so then look at the first phrase, that when it's 2 types, if it's 2 half kizaysim of the same type, they do combine. How are you going to understand that? 2 half kizaysim of chaylev, same type of cooking. Who in the world would say that doesn't combine? So Gemara says there is someone, because what happened was that you found out between the 2 half kizaysim that the first one was aser. Now, usually we say that if you find out that we did was aser, you can't combine the 2. But this is a sheet of Ram Gamliel that says if you find out about half a kazayis, it doesn't count as finding out, because you didn't find out that you're chayiv a carbon. Half a kazayis is not chayiv a carbon. You don't have to bring a carbon if you have a kazayis. So what he found out was not a chayiv carbon. The fact that he found out in between about half a kazayis doesn't count. The 2 half kazayisim before finding out and after finding out still combine to 1 chayiv chatos. Now the Gemara has another case which goes deeper into the issue over here. Let's say somebody ate 2 kazaysim of chaylev and didn't find out anything until after he ate them both, but he found out separately. He found out about the first kazayis first, and he found out about the second kazayis separately. So the two findings out are separate. Rav Yochanan says separate findings out, separate chiyuvim, 2 karbanis. Rish Lakish says no, that's 1 carbon. Now the Gemara says what's their sources? So they get it from the psukim. Rav Yochanan says the pasuk says al chatosai, and a little before that it says vehevi. So that indicates that for each chatosai there's a separate vehevi. For each sin there's a separate carbon. To tell me a case like this, that you found out separately, you have to bring a separate carbon for each. Rish Lakish says no, that's not what that's referring to. That's talking about where by the time he found out about the second chaylev that he ate, he had already brought his carbon for the first one. So a carbon that's already finished doesn't work when you find out later. Even though the carbon was brought after both chaylevs were eaten, but you didn't find out about the second one until after the carbon was brought. That everybody agrees. That even Rish Lakish agrees that the carbon doesn't work for something you were not aware of. Now, what is Reish Lakish's source? His pasuk is, it says, Mechatasoi v'nislachloi, which seems to indicate that he brings the carbon for his chatos, and then it'll be v'nislachloi, it'll forgive him, it'll forgive for him, it'll atone for him for something else. Chatasoi this, or nislachloi for something else. That's referring to where he found out about one, and then later he found out about the other one. So a carbon for one works for the other one, you don't have to bring separate karbanos for each. Rabbi Yechon says that's not referring to that. That's talking about a funny case. He ate a kazayas and a half, and then later he ate a half. And he found out about the first kazayas and a half, and later found out about the second kazayas and a half. In this case, he only has to bring one, because his first knowledge about the kazayas and a half doesn't combine with the later half, and therefore you only have one unit, which is enough of a shear. That half is covered already. Half that he had before doesn't combine with the half that he had later, and therefore those who don't combine to a shear, he doesn't have to bring a carbon for them at all. He only has to bring for the 1.5 that he ate in one shot. Now the Gemara would like to understand this machlekes of Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish a little bit deeper. What exactly happened? When did he find out? What separated his two findings out? So the Gemara there are three potential ways to view this. Was it that they just found out at separate times? Nothing happened in between? Again, let's review the case. They ate a kazayas, he ate a kazayas chaylev. A while later, he ate another kazayas chaylev, he had not yet found anything out. Subsequently, he found out that the first one was aser. Now, did something happen before he found out that the second one was aser? Is it that it was just at a later time? That's the machlokes? Or maybe the machlokes is not a later time. The machlokes is where he actually set aside a carbon for the first one, and then he found out about the second one. Now, what about if he had set aside a carbon for the first one and actually brought it and later found the second one? That is not machlokes. That everybody would agree that definitely is not a machlokes. The kapara of the first one does not work for the second one they hadn't found out about yet. The question is it just a span of time that separated the two findings out, or was there an actual setting aside of a carbon that separated the two findings out? So the Gemara says that it's both. The machlokes is in both cases. In both cases, Rav Yochanan would say 2 karbanos, and Reish Lakish would say 1. How do you know? Because they were arguing over how to explain the psukim. If they only argued over one of the cases, then the other one would explain the pasuk that way. If Rav Yochanan agreed to Reish Lakish in the case where there was only separation of time between the two findings out, he would say, "Oh, your pasuk of chatasai v'nisach is talking about that case. You wouldn't have to come on to this case of 1.5 and a half." And if Reish Lakish agreed to Rav Yochanan in the case where they set aside a carbon in between, so then he would say that that's the case that your pasuk was referring to chatasai v'hevi. You wouldn't have to go to a case where you actually brought the carbon in between. So says that doesn't prove anything. Because it could be that the person who said those answers didn't know. He was also bothered by the question, where is this machlokes? So he decided to go l'chomer both ways and look for a case besides these two. He didn't know. They only argue over one of the two cases. They only argue either over the case where there was a separation in between of only time, but they both agree that if you set aside the carbon that you are chayiv 2, or they argue about that case and they both agree that you're not chayiv 2 if there was only separation of time. But the person who said the sugya of how they would each learn the pasuk wasn't sure which one it was, and therefore he looked for other cases, and that's why he used the cases that he did.